Salem, as Policy Coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'll be leading this breakout session along with our guest speaker, Pat Crowley, who I don't see in the participant list. So maybe we'll give, oh, there you are. Great, maybe we can pin you. Awesome. So hi, everyone. I'm Kai Salem, Policy Coordinator at Green Energy Consumers. Pat, would you like to introduce yourself while I bring up the screen share?
Sure. My name is Patrick Crowley, and I am the Secretary Treasurer of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO.
Wonderful. And today we'll be talking about the nexus of climate jobs and climate policy. We are thrilled to work with Pat in the Climate Jobs Coalition, which Pat will be talking about for a little bit today. And although I do not work directly with climate jobs, that is Priscilla De La Cruz, who you all were already introduced to. I do work on policy here in Rhode Island, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. So you should all be able to see my screen, and we will get started. So we'll talk very briefly, 5 minutes introduction to climate jobs Rhode Island, as well as a 5-minute introduction to the policy that we work on. Move into primarily Q&A, and should have plenty of time for that. So here in Rhode Island, we have a goal of reducing emissions to net zero by 2050, and that is to address the climate crisis. We were thrilled earlier this year to celebrate the passage of the Act on Climate, which sets Rhode Island's first mandatory economy-wide and science-based emissions reductions targets. This is the first and most important, this is the first climate policy that Rhode Island has passed in about 7 years, and it is by far the most significant because now we can keep Rhode Island's government accountable to acting on climate. It is our hope that this will kind of unleash the floodgates of the climate policy we need to grow our green economy and reduce emissions in line with that goal to net zero by 2050. A huge shout out to all of the legislators and advocates who worked hard to get this passed, in particular, the sponsors, Senator Don Oyer and Representative Lauren Carson, as well as Majority Leader Chris Buzadowski, who sponsored this bill in previous years. Along the bottom of this slide are a little breakdown from DEM of where emissions in Rhode Island come from. You can see that the biggest source of emissions is transportation, but we also need to reduce emissions from our electric sector and our heating sectors if we are to get to our climate goals. So all of our policy is focused on reducing emissions from those sectors. We want policy that are cost-effective, equitable, and accelerates our current pace of reducing emissions because that's what we need to address the climate crisis. Our current policies that we're supporting, here's our policy cheat sheet for our priorities this session. We already passed the Act on Climate, yay. So now we are on to our goal of getting 100% renewable electricity by 2030, passing legislation called the Transportation Emissions and Mobile Community Act that would implement the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, which I'll talk about briefly on a later slide. We also need to extend and strengthen energy efficiency, which is a crucial way to build green jobs and also reduce emissions from both the electric and building sectors. We can do that by updating the efficiency required in appliances sold in Rhode Island, that's appliance efficiency standards, and extending our current energy efficiency programs currently run by National Grid, where you can get free home energy audits. These programs do a myriad of other things as well to support energy efficiency in Rhode Island. These are just a few of the great policies that are on the table this session. The session has seen some incredible energy legislation, but these are the ones that are our absolute priorities for acting on climate change this legislative session. So I'll touch briefly on two of our priorities. One is 100% renewable electricity by 2030. If we pass this bill, which would implement the Governor Raimondo's executive order from January 2020, and would extend our existing renewable energy standard, which currently has us getting to 30% renewable electricity by 2030, it would update that and extend it to get to 100% by 2030. Passing this bill would make Rhode Island a leader in the country on clean energy. We would be one of the first, if not the first state to get to this goal. It would also put us ahead of the federal timeline. President Biden recently announced the goal of getting to 100% renewable electricity by 2035. So this is in line with and even a little bit more ambitious than what we're talking about for the rest of the country. Perhaps most importantly, this is doable. If we go forward with the procurements of offshore wind, which is an affordable and job-creating source of clean energy, we would be on track to reaching 82% of our renewable energy, of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. So we need to update the renewable energy standards just to absorb that new renewable energy coming into the state, but also make sure that we get all the way to 100%. On this graph on the right side here, you can see that this was from the renewable energy study done by Office of Energy Resources last year. That 4,600 gigawatt hour gap that it says it would take to get to 100%, almost all of that would be satisfied by doing that 600 megawatt offshore wind procurement. So offshore wind is crucial to getting to this goal. We also support the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a regional initiative to put a price on fossil fuel emissions from transportation and raise money for clean transportation projects. This program, Massachusetts and Connecticut are fully committed. We are hoping that Rhode Island commits as well by passing the TEAM Act I mentioned earlier. It's sponsored by Senator DeMario and Rep. Corporation. This would bring $20 million per year into Rhode Island for clean transportation projects and reduce emissions 26% from the transportation sector compared to a baseline of 2022. So we do not do this work alone. In fact, working together with partners like Climate Jobs Rhode Island is crucial to getting to strong policy in Rhode Island. We need tons of voices in this. We need all of you to weigh in on climate policy. We need to work with our legislative champions and talk to many different constituencies. That is why we are so thrilled to work with Pat and the other folks at Climate Jobs Rhode Island, and I'll turn it over to Pat now.
Great, thank you very much, Kai, and thank you for all the hard work that you and everyone at Green Energy Consumers Alliance does on a daily basis. So the Rhode Island AFL-CIO represents 80,000 working women and men across the state of Rhode Island in just about every single industry in the state. And we're happy to join with our friends in the environmental community through Climate Jobs Rhode Island as a way for the labor movement and the environmental movement to join forces so that we can do our best to make sure that Rhode Island transitions in a just way to a green economy. For us, that means something that's grounded in economic, environmental, racial, and social justice. Next slide. And in order to get to that net zero economy, we need to be mindful about how we do that. And by centering racial and social justice as part of the conversation, we can use the discussion about environmental justice to try to make our world a better place at every single intersection of these ideas. And for us, that means putting the voices of the people that are most affected by pollution, which is both frontline workers and the people that live in the communities directly impacted by polluting economies, they have a voice and a say in this. Now, for us in the labor movement, a just transition must contain strong labor standards. We need to protect family supporting wages. We need to have transparency with how state money or federal money is spent, not just to make sure that it's being spent properly, but that it's being spent wisely so that it doesn't recreate or perpetuate systematic racism. And we need to make sure that we have strong industry training standards, because as we transition into this new economy and we create new jobs, we need to make sure that these jobs, that the workers doing this work are well trained, well paid, and well protected, and not just thrown to the wind or thrown to the wolves of some industries that want to exploit them. Next slide. So that's why one of the most important things about Climate Jobs Rhode Island is that it's a place for people that sometimes will disagree to be able to talk about those disagreements. We understand that in the labor movement and the environmental movement, we're not going to be in line on every single project in the state. But we've already seen this Climate Jobs Coalition be able to help work through some issues that have surfaced. Whether it's about solar siting, whether it's about the right standards to apply to projects in the state, by working together on the big picture issues, we can solve and work through the problems that may surface at the lower level. And I'll be honest with you, when we first started to have these conversations, this was the biggest point of consternation with a lot of the labor folks. How do we talk about this with our friends in the environmental movement? And talking with our friends in the environmental movement, they saw a lot of the same problems. How do we talk about this with union guys, when we need to get the economy in a better place? And the more and more we talk through these issues, the more we found common ground in the areas where we disagreed with. Quite frankly, were not issues about disagreement on policy. They were just different approaches and using different language. And a lot of the work that we've done in Climate Jobs Rhode Island has been to bridge those gaps. And one of the things that's really been fun to be part of is something we're calling shared learning opportunities, where our friends in the building trades unions have been able to explain to our friends in the environmental movement and other groups, what exactly is a project labor agreement and how does it help working people? And on the flip side of that, our friends in the environmental movement explaining to working people, this is what we mean by climate resiliency. This is what we mean by frontline communities. And when we talk those issues through, we've been able to find that the amount of common ground that we have is pretty amazing, because we all believe in social justice. We all believe in an economy that serves working people instead of the other way around. So knowing those things, now it's just a question of how do we really maximize our efforts going forward. Next slide. So I think that's it.
That's it. So I will stop the share for now, and we have some time for questions, which you may either put in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll try to unmute you. And I can kick things off by asking Pat, is there a policy, is there a number one policy or a couple of policies that Climate Jobs is focusing on now that Act on Climate has passed, that you think could be most important for filling those goals?
There's a few examples, Kai. One of them obviously is the TEAM Act now, the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is something we think is very important going forward. And working with our friends in the environmental movement and some of the legislators, being able to embed within that legislation language about worker standards and labor standards into the actual text of the legislation, so that right from the jump, we can make sure that if we are able to pass this bill into law, and the state has this funding source available to start, deliberately transitioning into a green economy, that the work that gets produced by that pot of money will be done meeting area labor standards, so that working people, instead of a race to the bottom, we can create the green union jobs that President Biden talks about. That's one of the slides that you talked about at the beginning that showed the distribution of how energy is emitted into the state, or how fossil fuel and carbon emissions are emitted into the state. 35% of that comes from the transportation industry. Well, that's Teamster jobs. That's bus driver jobs. That's school bus driver jobs. I don't know how many folks have, when was the last time you might have been on a school bus? But man, those things are polluting. They're awful. And it's tough work. So by being able to talk about not only the hard work and the really low paid work, but talk about how that's an industry that exploits not just their workers, but exploits the environment. And by involving the state in the federal government, by trying to up the standards for environmental protections, it helps the environment, it helps the people that are working on the buses, it helps the students, and it helps the overall community. And that's just one example of the intersection of all these places where we're pushing on things. Beyond that, there's a number of places where we've been talking about that, the labor movement and the environmental movement are pushing together. So my friends in the Painters Union are pushing a corrosion act. A lot of times, especially industrial workers that are cleaning, old mill buildings, they're remediating these really environmental toxic areas. But unless you're doing that under a union contract, these workers are totally exposed to toxic chemicals and really unsavory working conditions. So we have an interest in making sure that these mill projects are done so that the environmental hazards that they cause can be remediated, but we want to make sure that the workers doing that work are safe. So there's bills that are in place that would make those two things one. There's other areas, like, for example, the Green Buildings Act, to incorporate project labor agreements and area wage and labor standards into the text of the legislation, so that we can build products and build things going forward. But not only that, but do so that working people have a way to, rise up into the middle class. And I can see there's a question here from Louise. If I don't get the question right, please tell me. One of the things I'm most proud of is that Climate Jobs Rhode Island has really been pushing this idea of free RIPTA, to make public transportation free. Not a little bit free, not free for some people, not free on Sundays and holidays, free. It's short money. It's 20 million bucks, maybe 25 all in. I mean, give me a break. We have a $12 billion state budget. We have trillions of dollars in spending capacity in the state. I don't want to hear any of this baloney that we can't afford it. We know we can afford it. It's a question of will, as not a question of can. And not only that, here's the thing I love about the free RIPTA proposal. People that spend time together don't hate each other. And right now, we don't spend enough time across communities. One place where we could spend more time across communities is on the bus on the way to work, so that person carrying a briefcase is sitting next to the guy carrying a lunch bucket, so that the person in the wheelchair is spending time next to the person who has to stand up to give their seat away to someone who needs it. It's hard to hate the people that you see every single day, because you get to know them, you get to experience what they experience, and they get to experience you. So it's all of these things. That's social justice to me. So I'll stop there and let it go on.
In that vein a little bit, so I feel like the work that Climate Jobs has been doing is in part so powerful, because it is bringing together two communities that don't know each other. Is there one particular misconception or new thing that you think that you'd like environmentalists to know about the labor community?
Yeah, the labor movement isn't a bunch of old white guys all the time. It never really was, but if you read a story in the Providence Journal, you just kind of think about it. What's the first image of a union member comes to mind? It looks like my friend Scott Duhamel's on the screen. I can see his face. You kind of get this picture of this big rough guy, maybe 5 o'clock shadow and a hard hat. The average union member in the state of Rhode Island is a woman between the ages of 35 and 50. We represent more women and people of color than any other industry in the state. And across the country, there's more women, there's more people of color than people imagine. But because of the way the mainstream media portrays the labor movement, they want us to all look like, people like me, quite frankly. And the reality is they look like my coworker, Autumn, who's here on the screen as well. And I think that's one thing that we've got to be able to perpetuate. And on the flip side, from the labor movement's point of view, I rode to work today on my e-bike. But that doesn't mean that, every environmentalist is, wearing hippie jeans and smoking a joint, eating their granola while they're walking to work. Nothing is wrong with that. I do that every day if I had the opportunity to. But it's this idea that we've allowed these stereotypes of each other's communities to color our approach to how we have these conversations. I'll be the first to admit, it's not uncommon for folks on our calls to drop an F-bomb. And more often than not, it's not the union guys that are doing it. It's the folks in the environmental movement that are saying, this is bullshit too. And I think we need to have that kind of friendly camaraderie to understand that we're all this is a struggle, and we're all in the struggle together, and we leave our preconceptions, aside.
So I have two other questions from the chat that I'll ask together. One from Loie around, I think that these are very tied together. So one from Crystal is, what are some of the key green job training programs that presently exist, and what will we need to make this transition? The other question is from Loie around, will transitioning to electric transportation mean reducing the number of vehicle maintenance jobs, and is that a conflict? And I ask these together because I think the answer might be tied in some ways.
No, you're right, Kaya. I think they are kind of tied. So in the labor movement, one of the big things that we really talk about as much as possible is this idea of apprenticeship as a pathway into good paying union jobs. And one of the ways that the Rhode Island labor movement does this, and this is really kudos to our friends in the Rhode Island building trades, is through a program that's called Building Futures. And what Building Futures does is deliberately go out and recruit underrepresented communities, many ex-offenders, many people that live within frontline communities, people of color, especially men and women of color, to try to get them into a skilled trade in a place that they feel welcome and safe and secure, so that they can begin to learn the craft of whatever path they want to choose, whether that's becoming a painter, becoming a laborer, becoming an electrician. And the labor movement, especially in the building trades and Building Futures, pushes this apprenticeship model so that we can bring people into the trades as not only as a way to diversify ourselves, which is an intentional goal of ours, but as a way to make sure that the good union jobs that we're accustomed to now can be distributed broader throughout the larger Rhode Island community. 30, 40, 50 years ago, a lot of our members lived right in the urban core because that's where the jobs were. As we became successful, we left the urban core, we moved out to the suburbs, like most Americans do. But that doesn't mean that we have to put up a fence on our way out the door. We've got to make sure that we build those barriers, take down whatever barriers that we have. And that's one of the things that we can do. Now, more specifically, Crystal, to your question, as we start to transition really intentionally with the influx of federal dollars from the federal government to get this transition work going, there's programs that a lot of our individual unions do. And I'm thinking specifically of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW, Local 99, who have their own training facility that are specifically working on training the next generation of solar installation. Right now, Local 99 has about 2,000 members. Well, sorry, they have about 2,000 members, about 250 to 300 working women and men specifically working on solar. They have the capacity and they have the availability to double, triple, if not quadruple that over the next 5 years. And it's just a question of, can we create the market so that those folks entering into those apprentice type jobs and getting their journey person status have the work available. And it looks like we're going to be able to. Now, to address Loie's question about, is this going to mean that we have fewer mechanic jobs or fewer jobs that are tied directly to the servicing of legacy transportation needs? I think the answer is yes, or maybe is probably an easier way to do it. One of our concerns has always been, we represent the bus drivers for RIPTA. They're members of ATU, of the Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 618. And part of their workers are the diesel fuelers, literally the men and women who fuel up the buses. We don't need to put diesel in. What are we going to do with those folks? Well, the simple answer is to retrain them, but it's going to take more than that. And this is part of the conversation that I have all the time. It's easier to retrain a 22-year-old than it is a 55-year-old who maybe have graduated high school 40 years earlier or 35 years earlier. and you're looking at that person who's 55, 56, 60 years old, they've worked their entire lives, but they're not yet ready to retire. And you're trying to, too often the conversation is, well, just get trained. Come on, give me a break. I'm not quite that old and I don't want to do any more training. I don't want to have my livelihood or the livelihood of my family sacrificed just for the sake of transitioning from one thing to another. So part of it, yes, has to be transitioning in training for jobs, but also we need to start thinking of ways where we can create some kind of, whether it's funding, security, whatever, so that that person doesn't feel like their livelihood is completely sacrificed at some, for an idea that may or may not work. One of the things that I'm really intrigued about, and no state has done this well yet, but when they started to close mines in West Virginia, Kentucky, 25, 30 years ago, they created these transitional funds, and basically they bought people out. I think as we start to, look at how the federal money is coming in, maybe there's ways Rhode Island can create some kind of transition fund, and not, giving that 55-year-old person who's making $60,000 a year with overtime a $1,500 voucher to go to Rick to take a couple of classes. I mean income replacement. I mean, career replacement, so that if that person wants to go try something new, great. If they don't, but they want to make sure that they have the resources there to pay for their health insurance and feed their family, and maybe make sure that their younger kids are going through college, all of that needs to be part of this conversation. And again, it's not a question of money. We have enough money. We spend how many trillions of dollars a year on missiles and tanks and bombs? Don't tell me it's not about money. We can cut taxes for the rich as often as we want, and no one ever cares about the cost. God forbid we talk about a working person maybe being able to sit back with their feet on their chair and watch the sunset with their wives and their husbands, as if somehow that's some kind of social cost that we can't afford. I just don't buy it.
Thanks. So another question we have is about challenges to advancing our work. And I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges on the policy front. So first, I think the passage of the Act on Climate is really big, and it shows that we can pass good progressive climate legislation in Rhode Island. In addition to setting these mandatory targets, it also requires an equity-based planning process to achieve our new emissions goals. But I think we are, of course, impatient, and we want to see Rhode Island starting how we're going to think about meeting these goals, what types of other policies we'll need. Passing an Act on Climate is not enough. And one challenge is that leaders or members of the public will think that we don't need to do more. Really, an Act on Climate sets a structure and a foundation for all of the climate work that we do need to do, which include the TEAM Act and 100% renewable electricity. And so one challenge would be keeping the momentum up and continuing to work to pass this legislation. Certainly at Green Energy Consumers, we are not slowing with our momentum. Another challenge is the perception that environmental policy is just about spending money. I think that the policies that Green Energy Consumer supports and climate job supports really demonstrate why that is a misconception. For example, the TEAM Act is about bringing money to Rhode Island. We spend billions of dollars on fossil fuels here in Rhode Island, and all of that money is going out of state. It's creating jobs out of state. It's creating pollution both here in our state and also in other places in the country and world. And by reducing our spend on fossil fuel money and keeping that on in-state clean jobs, in-state clean energy development, we are working on building the economy, and we're also avoiding the impact, the public health costs. So I think a lot of environmental policy is about making sure that we make this transition in the most cost-effective way possible and making our energy system more affordable and equitable and reliable as we go. So I think it's a challenge for those who work on climate policy and green economy policy to convey that, create a vision of a better more affordable energy future, more a future with better green jobs. And that is integral to our policy vision. We saw that came up a lot in the debate over Act on Climate. And hopefully as we advance these other policies, we get really good at making the case that transitioning to clean energy is better for Rhode Islanders for reasons far beyond the environmental benefits. Pat, would you have anything to add on that question about major challenges to our shared green economy agenda?
Yeah, cynicism. We've been beaten into submission in this country, especially over the last couple of years. We're so on guard from what other people might think. And when they don't have a deep understanding of our issues, we tend to think that they're against us. And if they're against us, then they're our enemy. And I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish on this, but my experience in learning about some of the more, I mean, I thought of myself as an environmentalist. I live with a partner who spends 20 hours a day talking environmental policy. I didn't know anything about it when I really started to get into it. I didn't even know the language. I didn't know the words. I didn't know the phrases. I don't want to, cast any aspersions, but everyone on the call, we're the unusual ones. We actually spend time thinking about this every single day. The average Rhode Islander is just like the average legislator. They don't spend all of their time thinking through all of these things, but they want to approach it from a position of good-heartedness. And I think we need to be able to figure out in this movement how we can make this less intimidating to people who might not have all of the same language, might not have all of the same understanding of the science, but want to do the right thing and just don't know what that is, and find a way to overcome that. And I think by working together with the labor movement and the environmental movement, we can begin to tackle some of that cynicism that pervades so much of us and work against it.
That's great. And one, as we get close, I think we have 2 minutes left in our time here. I will make the pitch now to you all we have just about a month left in this legislative session, and we invite all of you, whether this is your full-time advocacy job or not, to get involved with passing some of this important legislation before the end of the session. The TEAM Act, that's the TCI enablement, 100% renewable electricity, extending energy efficiency, working on free RIPTA. All of these are policies that are currently before the Rhode Island legislature, and we can make happen before the end of June. So stay tuned for our policy blogs and future webinars, phone banks, other events that aim to engage you all in the work that we are doing to pass this policy here in Rhode Island, because the outpouring of support for Act on Climate was why that passed, and we need to do that again if we're to pass all of these other great pieces of legislation. And I think we all can go back to the main room. See you there.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. This was the coolest breakout session. Just remind everyone when we go back.